Well, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. A mega blessing to all of you. This is another live stream of Let Us Reason. And I'm your host, Al Fadi, and with us here, a dear brother and a wonderful, wonderful contributor and a researcher, goes by the name of Brother Mill. Out of respect, of course, we want to just keep it that way for his safety and security. But all that to say is, if you've been watching any of my most recent videos that I've done with Mill, you probably have noticed that he focuses also on historical criticism of the standard Islamic narrative, which we have already nicknamed SIN. All that to say is that today's topic is no exception, except we're dissecting now a number of elements of that standard Islamic narrative. And today we will be focusing on a water well known by the name of Zamzam, that at least the traditions or the Islamic tradition, historically speaking, connects that well to Mecca and to Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. And I will share more about that. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us right now from Europe, those who are joining us also from the US and North America and other parts of the world. I know the time difference sometimes can limit some of you. I want to welcome also those of you who are joining us from Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia. But all that to say is, like, we are so blessed to have platforms like this that enable us to reach the world just from the tip of our fingers, literally, with a small camera in front of us. We're so thankful for that. And also, I am more thankful than ever before that our dear brother here, Mel, agrees to work with me and collaborate with me, in addition to the wonderful work he's doing in his own channel and the work he's doing with our brother, Jay Smith. With that in mind, Mel, welcome back, brother.
It's great to be back, and whenever you call me, I'm always only too delighted to link up with you and share any little bit of knowledge that I've gained in my research. So always a pleasure.
Wonderful. So why don't you give people just maybe the 1 minute snippet about what you're going to cover? Then I'm going to show a couple of slideshows basically about the well of Zamzam and why it's important.
Okay, so Muslims have been told for years that the Zamzam is has an endless supply of water, and so in the first half, I'm going to investigate if that is actually true, and we can actually see that it isn't. And the second thing is, there's a little bit of a surprise, and it's in relation to where Muhammad is buried. There's a split in the narrative. There seems to be two stories about where he's buried, which is very suspicious indeed. So that's going to come up in the second half.
Wonderful. With that in mind, of course, I want to welcome those of you who are joining us right now, and I will even welcome our moderators. We have a moderator that is so early right now for them, at least in my book, 6 o'clock in the morning is early, but maybe it's not in Australia. But all that to say is, I'm going to share with you folks about 3 slides worth of images related to the well of Zamzam. And I want to share with you why, as a Muslim, a former Muslim, I should say, it was a special, basically story and tradition. And at the same time, I want to also tie this into what Mel is going to be talking about concerning the unlimited supplies. And that's extremely important. A miraculous unlimited supply of water that allegedly have existed since the days of Abraham, Hagar, and Ishmael. Do the math. We're talking more than 4,000 years now. And of course, if there is any truth to that, everybody will be taken away by that and say, wow, that's amazing. No doubt about that. I'm not saying we can't find wells of water that have lasted for, hundreds of years. I'm not denying that God can allow things like this to happen. We're just focusing on one particular well that allegedly exists in Mecca today. I mean, it does exist in Mecca, but allegedly it existed there since the days of Abraham. And it has something that is special about it, miraculous about it, spiritual about it, that connects us and ties it to many things related to Abraham and Ishmael's alleged travel to Mecca, building the city itself, building the Kaaba, and also the fact that there is a connection between Hagar, Ishmael, and this well. And I'm going to start my slideshow, and I will share with you why such a thing is extremely important. Now, everybody will see this, the well of Zamzam here, and let me tell you why this is extremely important. Now, here is an image of Mecca today, And really, it hasn't changed much. The Kaaba, as you can see it in the center over there, draped with this fancy black silk covering that cost anywhere from 1 to 2 million sometimes. Probably right now will even cost more, with gold, letterings and all that kind of stuff. What you see in front of the Kaaba, if you look all the way down at the bottom of the image itself, you're going to see some sort of a tunnel. And these are steps that takes you underneath that whole platform, where you will use water to either do ablution, shower if you wish, drink, just clean up. The water is coming from what we call today the well of Zamzam. It has a special taste to it, different taste, strange taste for some people, obviously, but that's where you would find it. Now I'm going to keep going further here. I'm showing you some images about why this thing is important. I mean, if you look on the right side, you'll see people are drinking from it. You'll see people in this in the right side in the center image performing ablution. Today, the well is symbolically fenced off like this, with a plaque describing its history. And at the same time, they have piping. I mean, if you watch, I think you will be watching a video series that I did with Jay recently, where we talked about the dilemma, or many dilemmas with Mecca, including Zamzam as one of those. You're going to see some pipes, massive piping that is going to pump the water in and out and so on and so forth. But look in the middle. Look in the middle. There is a foundation actually known as the Foundation of Zamzam. And part of that is to promote, of course, Zamzam. And at the same time, there are businesses that are generated out of this. You can see bottles of water, that have Zamzam. You can go to any, by the way, Middle Eastern store. I don't know if that's the case, for instance, in UK or in Europe, but I'm pretty sure that will be true. Anywhere you go, they have bottles of Zamzam. Most of the time, they'll sell it to you. People, when they go to perform pilgrimage, their family ask them and beg them to bring gallons of that, because they believe it has a spiritual healing powers and all kind of claims, of course. And I remember I had a surgery one time, and I would wash that surgery with the water of Zamzam, hoping that it will expedite the healing. That's, again, I believed it with all of my heart. You go to the far left of the slide. At the top, you see a depiction, or you can say basically a longitudinal, basically cut section that will show you where the well exists in relationship to the Kaaba. It's almost like, I wouldn't exaggerate if I say it's about maybe 20 yards, give or take, away from the entrance of the Kaaba itself. That's traditionally where the well is. You can see in the lower photo that it's been sealed off, and that's when they built the tunnel, technically speaking, but people can still see the original location of that. So these are the things that I wanted to share, and I'm going to close it with this cartoon video. And I'm not going to play the video here, but the cartoon video is about the story of Hagar. You see, Islam teaches, at least traditionally speaking, that Hagar migrated with her son Ishmael and, of course, his father Abraham, made it all the way to Mecca, and they ran out of water. Abraham's allegedly left her, and she was alone with the kid. She ran out of water. She began to really panic. And she started to run between two mountains, the Safa and Marwa. And until finally, after 7 times, she noticed that there is a well that an angel dug for her. And that's the well of Zamzam. I don't want to take up much of the time of Mel here, but I wanted to give everyone kind of like a glimpse of what we mean by Zamzam and why is it such a big deal. All right, Mel, I'll turn it over to you, brother.
Yeah, I was actually really curious by that picture you showed of various people lined up drinking from the taps underground. And imagine there are thousands of people drinking from that water, filling up their bottles. That's a lot of water. If you imagine there's tens of thousands of people, I don't know how many can fit in the Kaaba area at one time, but I'd imagine it's in the tens of thousands, if not 250,000. I don't know. Do you know off the top of your head how many can get in around that area?
In the Zamzam well? No, I mean, it's limited.
In the Kaaba area itself. So presumably people would go in turns
Absolutely. The last 10 days of Ramadan alone, before the pilgrimage also, it can accommodate up to 2 million. Right now, they made it even, able to accommodate up to 4 million people. And during the pilgrimage, it's almost the same number. So absolutely, we're talking millions of people that come in, not to mention thousands daily, of course, throughout the year.
Yeah. So just doing a simple bit of maths in our heads is, so let's just say there's 2 million and each of them take maybe 2 liters. And that's very minimal, because you imagine some are filling maybe a gallon to bring home and so on. So 2 by 2 million, you're talking about 4 million liters straight off in a day. And so we're assuming that's a lot of water, and we're assuming that underneath the ground there's 4 million liters minimum to be able to do that. And I find that really hard to believe. So the water is coming from somewhere. I'm going to be sharing where the water is actually coming from. And it reminded me a little bit of about 20 or 30 years ago in Northern Ireland. There was a border in Northern Ireland, and there were farmers who had cattle on both sides of the border. And what they used to do to get around export and importation sort of issues, they would bring the cattle in one end of their shed, say on one side of the border, and then take the cattle out on the other side of the shed, on the other side of the border. And of course, the authorities couldn't tell, when they're being imported or exported, because they're hidden in that shed. So I see a very similar situation. They have the well pretty much hidden now. They've kind of sealed off. We can see pipes there. Water's been drawn from it, but we're not 100% sure if there are pipes actually feeding the well as well. And I think that's all very suspicious. I think if they had it fully exposed, people would start to put 2 and 2 together, but it's actually convenient for them that it's all kind of covered up, So having said that, I'm going to share some slides now. Let me just see how this goes. I'm not seeing my PowerPoint, so I wonder why.
It's no problem. And I'm going to address a couple of comments while you're looking at that.
Okay.
And when I see it. I mean, I know it gives you a couple of options at the top, probably.
Yeah, got it now.
Yeah, we found it. One person was saying that he remembers a friend saying that they would use Zamzam water to splash it on a person that they perceive to be demonically possessed. That's true. It has, like I said, people believe that it has many spiritual powers. At least that's the belief. Does it work? I very much doubt it. But with that in mind, you want me now to bring your slides?
Yep. So can you see it now?
Yes, there it is.
Yep. Okay, so those are some examples of bottles of water that you could get from the Zamzam. Supposedly comes from the well. Yeah. Okay, so the Zamzam dilemma is that some Muslims claim that the Zamzam well offers an endless supply of water. This has been used to support the claim that Mecca was a great trading center, even centuries before Islam began. But is this true? So an awful lot hinges on this claim that there's an endless supply of water, because essentially up to the 8th century, the Zamzam was it. There were a few small wells, but if that didn't have an endless supply of water, or very nearly, the claim that it was a stopping point along a trade route is really hard to sustain as a claim. Now, so the current context, just so we're kind of touching base with reality here, is that Saudi Arabia faces a major water challenge. We're not just talking about Mecca, but across the country. It uses more water than its natural aquifers can supply. So Saudi Arabia is the largest producer of desalinated water in the world. In 2011, the volume of water supplied by the country's 27 desalination plants at 17 locations was 3.3 million cubic meters of water a day, or 1.2 billion cubic meters of water a year. So a lot of water being produced through the desalination plants. Now, key question is, how much water does Mecca need to keep its city going? So Mecca and Medina have a similar size population of 1.3 million. So by looking into what it was for Medina, I was able to work out what it would be for Mecca. We know that a reverse osmosis plant in Yanbu, located on the shore of the Red Sea, supplies the city of Medina with 128,000 cubic meters of water a day. So we would expect that Mecca would need a similar amount. I think that's a fairly intuitive conclusion. But the question is, could the Zamzam supply that quantity of water? I would suggest not. That's a lot of water. To put it into context, that's the equivalent to extracting 51 Olympic swimming pools of water a day. Not just on one day, but continuously every single day. This is well beyond the capacity of the Zamzam. Not only can the Zamzam not supply enough water, it also couldn't way back in the 8th century for a much, much smaller population of passing pilgrims. So we have Mecca there. There's 1.3 million people. It isn't depending on the Zamzam for water for all those people, clearly. And I would say not only that, but also for the pilgrims. There's no way the Zamzam could supply that quantity of water for the pilgrims. So it must be getting the water from somewhere else. Now, so just imagine you are pumping water from the Zamzam. We know that they have a pump from the Zamzam, and we know how much water it can pump in a second. It's actually anywhere from 11 to 19 liters of water per second. So doing a little bit of maths, what would that produce? That would give us just 1,641 cubic meters of water in a day, right? Just 1,641. So just if we go back to the previous slide, how much do we need? We need 128,000, right? The Zamzam, at the very best, presuming there's water down there, the pump, the little measly pump there, can only pump out that amount of water in a day. So there's no way the Zamzam can be supplying the water for Mecca. Okay, so, and that's again assuming that there's a huge aquifer underneath that, and that the pump will never run out of water to pump up, but even at the best, that's all it can pump out. So that's the issue facing Mecca. It can only pump 1,641 cubic meters of water in a day, and yes, Mecca needs 128,000 a day. Okay, so here is where 99.9% of Mecca's water comes from. Surprise, surprise, a desalination plant in Jeddah. And this, I think, is probably not a surprise to most Muslims. If they're, halfway informed, it kind of makes sense.
I live there, and I've seen it. In fact, the entire district is named after this, known as a tahliya, which is desalinization in Arabic, basically. And I used to even go near it because I'm a scuba diver. They won't allow you to get so close, but you can see the piles of salt that they have compiled from there.
Right. Okay. And imagine it's quite a site. Imagine it's a huge complex to produce that amount of water.
It is indeed. It is. And they were really innovative in this idea because they needed to supply water to not just Mecca, but even the central part of Saudi. So there is a lot of these plants on both coasts.
Yeah. And obviously it requires a huge amount of energy, and is really just the discovery of oil. I would imagine it's about 100 years ago that oil was first discovered in Arabia and started being pumped. But without that oil, this would be completely impossible. So it's really, it's a lucky thing that they found the oil where they did, because this would not be possible. And in fact, the population of Saudi Arabia currently would be impossible if the oil wasn't there. I would say it's fair to say. So remember, we saw that the Zamzam could pump out a maximum of 1,641 cubic meters of water a day. So that's a key kind of figure. But as we will see later, from the 9th to the 20th century, Mecca depended on the Ain Zubaida aqueduct for the majority of its water needs. And this only brought it at most between 600 and 800 cubic meters of water a day. In other words, about half of what that pump could pump out. So clearly, if it was still depending on that, it wouldn't be able to produce, 641. It would run out, by midday. It eventually dried up, this aqueduct, in the middle of the 20th century and had to be replaced by supplying water from the desalination plant in Jeddah. So that's a little bit of what's coming up. So until 1950, it received up to 800 cubic meters from the aqueduct, whereas today it needs 128,000 cubic meters. I hope, even for those who may be not mathematically minded, I hope just looking at those numbers might give you a sense of how little water was being supplied to Mecca and how much today is needed. Now, even taking into account the much smaller population that would have been there 100 years ago, you can see that actually the water situation would have limited Mecca hugely over the centuries. It wouldn't have been able to supply enough water, clearly, for millions of people if that was happening in the 19th century or the 18th century and so on. So it's probably just as well that the numbers have just increased very recently. And here's a key point. Before 801 AD, Mecca had a very limited supply of water, indeed, so little that Queen Zubaida spent a huge fortune on creating the aqueduct, as we'll soon find out. Okay, so up to 1950, 800 cubic meters of water was brought in from the aqueduct, which is not a lot. But before that, before 801, it didn't even have that. So it was solely dependent on the Zamzam. Now, unfortunately, I've not been able to get a figure for how much water the Zamzam can naturally produce. But as we'll see from the fact that they spent such a fortune on this aqueduct, it cannot have been much more than 800 cubic meters. I would probably guess that it was a lot less than these figures of,
Fortunately.
Yeah,
could you elaborate a little bit more for the benefit of our viewers? Who is Queen Zubaida, so that they can at least understand her connection?
Yeah, I'm actually going to come to her a little bit later, but essentially
okay, that's fine.
Yeah, essentially she was a queen that was married to a caliph, which I'll come to that in just a minute.
Wonderful. Okay, no problem.
Okay, so just you anticipated the next question. So here she is. It's a picture of her and the caliph next to her, and I'll give you all the details. She was an exceptionally intelligent woman that Islam owes the credit of its golden age to. She was born in 762 in Mosul, present-day Iraq, and in her youth she took a special interest in poetry, art, history, literature, and science, and she invited scholars and poets to Baghdad and allocated a fund for this purpose. So she was really, a very intelligent woman, a credit to any society, really. She's very open-minded, very intelligent, and she was married to the 5th Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid.
Oh, he's a very well-known one. Yeah.
Yep. And so she was very well placed. And if you think about the period that we're talking about, she was living in the latter half of the 8th century. The Abbasids took over around 750. So she decided that the water situation in Mecca was dire. Okay, so this is talking about 40 years after the Abbasids took over. That in itself suggests that this is all relatively new, the whole Mecca thing. The Mecca project, let's say, it's pretty obvious from what I've looked at here, as you'll see, that the Mecca project was really new at this stage. There wasn't this Mecca going back centuries before. It was all relatively new. It was being constructed relatively recently. And having constructed it, they realized there just isn't enough water for the pilgrims coming to visit it. Okay. Now, so she commissioned 2 aqueducts, one from the Wadi Hunain and the other from the Wadi Numan, east of Arafat. The latter is known as Ain Zubaida. I think the Ain Zubaida was the most significant, so I'm going to refer to them collectively as the Ain Zubaida from here on in, just to keep it nice and simple. And now, the construction of the aqueduct began in the 8th century and completed in exactly 801 AD. So why is that significant? Well, according to Patricia Crona, the first mention of Mecca on a map didn't occur until the 9th century, which is obviously very late. And there was never an explanation for why suddenly in the 9th century it suddenly appears on a map. Well, now I think it's fair to say we know why now, because without water, you can't really build a population in an area. You need water. People need water to wash. They need water to drink. They need water for their animals to grow some food. You know, without water, you can't do any of that. So it's all well and fine saying, okay, well, we just need a few liters of water each to drink, but that's not it. You need actually water if you want to plant some crops, grow some food. So this aqueduct was really the lifeline for Mecca. And as you can see, it's very late. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but the idea that there was any life happening in the 7th century before this aqueduct is really cloud cuckoo land. There was, at best, a small little well. It might have supported a really tiny population, but not much. And it's only really when they put a lot of money into this aqueduct that it was possible to have a proper settlement in this area. Okay. So the aqueduct was started in 791, took 10 years to build it, and it was 38 kilometers in length, and it cost a fortune, 1.7 million dinars, and 1 dinar is equal to 10 grams of gold. We're talking 24 karat gold here. So I've converted it in today's money, and it would be the equivalent of about $1 billion. Now, question for you, Al-Fadi. Do you think it's plausible that if there was an endless supply of water coming from the Zamzam, that the Abbasid regime would spend $1 billion in today's money building an aqueduct? Does that sound plausible to you?
Of course not. And at the same time, if it was an endless supply, unlimited supply, why does Allah need anyone to step in to beef it up? I mean, I don't understand. I mean, I thought it's a miraculous thing. Why does he need someone to come in and keep working around, finding ways to sustain it, if you wish?
Yeah, and the thing is, what I find really hard to understand is the fact that this aqueduct would have been really obvious to all the pilgrims from the 9th century onwards. They would have seen it coming in. They would have seen it supply water to the various wash areas, to the various individualized wells and so on. So it's replenishing those. So the idea that the Zamzam well had an endless supply of water, it was contradicted visually whenever they went to Mecca. So it's quite hard to believe that people would see that and not actually put 2 and 2 together and say, well, clearly it wasn't endless. But yet this myth kept going all through the centuries, even to this day. And actually, if you go on many Islamic websites, you'll still see that claim made even in the 21st century, despite all we know.
Right. I want to address just something. Some people are commenting. I don't know really. I don't want to read it in a positive or negative way, and I don't want to mention names. But some people are saying that there are evidence that Zamzam has been referenced since the days of Adam, or it existed at the time of Abdullah ibn Abbas, who is the cousin of Muhammad. I would cautious our viewers to pay attention to when was this report reported. What I mean is the date, because you're going to end up falling back into what we call the standard Islamic narrative, which was developed at a later time. So that might be true. There are sources that are saying this, but the question is, did this thing exist when these sources say it existed? Do we have a collaboration from outside sources? Are there Christians, for instance, that can collaborate this in their own writing, who've been, technically speaking, to the region? So I want to just people to be very careful not to fall into the same dilemma, relying on the standard Islamic narrative. Go ahead, brother.
Excellent point. And actually, if you think about when Ibn Hisham wrote his Cira, we're talking about 20 years after this aqueduct was built. That tells you something, you know. All of these things had to be first in place before they could tell the story of a place with a population that was viable, you know, that had plenty of water and so on. Prior to 801, this was just fairy tale stuff. No one would have believed these sort of stories. They first of all had to build the aqueduct. Then people could possibly believe these stories, despite the fact that they were still very legendary. But I think 801 is a key date. I think it's very useful. And you can really talk about Mecca pre-801 and post-801 from here on in. I think this could easily be the new year when Islam began, in a sense, because without the water, you know, you really don't have a Mecca. So it's that key, you know.
And Mil, have you looked at any satellite imagery, if you wish, concerning maybe the existence of these aqueducts or any ruins related to that?
I have, and it's a pity actually. I did have some images. I had I think I have a Google map of the aqueduct coming up, I think, but I did have a 19th century map of the aqueduct, but unfortunately I took it out just to shorten my presentation.
Oh, no problem. When we do the show, you and I, we can always expand on that. The purpose of the live stream is just to give us snippets of things.
Yeah. So I will come back to that, and I will show you the map that was there, and it's hard to see all the small details, but basically you can see it's been like an artery, and you can see the location of the various wells. It's quite fascinating to see it, you know. So, sort of answering your question to some extent, I've just done a journey from where the Wadi Numan is into Mecca, to kind of give you a rough idea of the journey of the aqueduct. Obviously, this is just if you were to drive into Mecca. But the aqueduct would have journeyed through that general area. Okay, so it's about 38 kilometers, not particularly long, but it was quite an engineering challenge to create this aqueduct because of the terrain, and that's why it was so expensive to make. But they did an amazing job. You know, sometimes, you know, we disparage early Islam, and we sometimes say, you know, the people were backward and so on. But actually, in this context, the people were incredibly advanced. The engineering was phenomenal to get the decline, you know, the right degree of decline, so that the water flowed but didn't flow too fast or too slowly. You know, that's actually very difficult to do even at the best of times. So I think, you know, credit to them. And this was the period that has been called the Golden Age. Obviously, the Golden Age didn't last too long, and eventually they got legalistic, and all of this scientific openness was lost. But at least at that time, there was a certain amount of scientific openness, and they were able to achieve amazing things. But so I think it's quite a wonder, really, of the time. So Queen Zubaida traveled to Mecca to perform Hajj. It became apparent to her that Mecca was facing a water shortage, and when she returned to Baghdad, she called on expert architects and engineers of the time to address this problem. After surveying the area, the initial report concluded that construction of a qanat, which is an aqueduct, could prove quite difficult. History relates the Queen's reply as, "Construct a qanat at any cost, even if I have to give a dinar in exchange for every single stroke of spade." Now, I've no idea if this quotation is reliable or not, but I think it conveys pretty well the kind of sense of they desperately needed this aqueduct. Otherwise, there was no Mecca. It was that important to them. And in 1950, the groundwater got too low.
And Mil, I want to add something. You see, brother, the picture is starting to fall in place, right? You know, all the pieces are starting to fall in place. Now, here's what I'm saying. In the Umayyads' time, you have a couple of caliphs in there, and who built, like for instance, They build massive buildings like the Dome of the Rock, for instance, and other architecture. Why in the world, if Mecca was that important, they wouldn't have done things like this? It wasn't until the Abbasides, which also agrees with what we are discovering so far, that things began to shift as we get closer to the Abbasides' time.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point. Like Abdul al-Malik spent an absolute fortune on the Dome of the Rock. If he
Ibn al-Malik, al-Ma'mun, you have all of these guys,
yeah, and so like if they knew at that time, and presuming Mecca existed, which is doubtful at that time, but let's just, you know, for the sake of argument, assume there was a Mecca in the Hijaz at that time, it would be inconceivable that he would spend the equivalent of millions in today's money, millions and millions, on the Dome of the Rock, and then leave Mecca with an inadequate water supply for another 100 years for someone else to deal with. Like that's just doesn't make sense. I think the easiest explanation is Mecca just simply wasn't in the picture until much
or
later.
wasn't that important for them.
Or not important, yeah, that's the other possibility too. I think really Jerusalem was important to the Umayyads, and the Abbasids wanted to focus on somewhere else. They couldn't have the same place, so Mecca became the new place that they wanted to focus on. So what happened with the aqueduct was that it remained in use until 1950. Modern pumping and increased consumption eventually depleted the well at the source, as the level of the groundwater fell too low to sustain the flow of water through the aqueduct. Ain Zubaida is now dry, and that's basically was the end of that. It's in disrepair; it's no longer in use, and so they started pumping water from Jeddah since then. So in more recent times, the Saudis overhauled the system, hooking up Mecca's water system with water from the desalination plants in Jeddah. So despite what we now know about the obviously inadequate supply of water from the Zamzam, even still, legends emerged about it, greatly exaggerating its water capacity. Now, I have a little bit more. I don't know if you want to say any more on that before we move on.
No, I think I've said enough so far, so keep going.
Okay, so the next thing is if we look at the reports from Mecca down through the centuries, and the problem with many of the sources that we have is that they often get edited over time, so we never know if we're dealing with a legitimate report from, say, the 9th century or the 10th century, because if there's something in it that's embarrassing, they tend to go back, edit it, you know, what we've seen so many times. But what's interesting is if we can find reports, say, from China or somewhere like that, and they write it down, then we at least have a record that has been tampered with, and it gives us a snapshot of what's going on. So as it happens, I have a couple of reports from China that I'd like to share with you. So there is a Chinese report about the Zamzam well. The first story about Mecca recorded in Chinese literature is in a book called Shi Lin Guan Ji, Extended Reports from the Real World. It is an anecdote about Mecca told by a Dashi merchant. Now, a Dashi refers to the Tayyaye, or they are the Muslims that lived in Iraq and traveled to China regularly, and it's told in by a Muslim merchant in a seaport in Fujian province, probably the seaport of Zaytun, or I'm going to say Quanzhou, I think is how it's pronounced. Here's it in Chinese. So if your Chinese is any good, you can have a look for yourself.
It looks Chinese to me.
So here it is in English. And this account tells pretty much the standard story of Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. So a lot of this is kind of, no surprises really. So it says there was anciently a desert with no people or settlements. The ancestor of Dashi, called Pulu Hong, which is considered Abraham, was endowed from childhood with a remarkable personality. When he grew up, he married a wife who gave birth in the desert to a son. There was no water for washing the baby. So she put the baby on the ground and went to look for water without finding any. So this is all pretty familiar. When she returned, she saw her son kicking the ground with his heel, and a spring came forth with the purest of water. The son was given the name Si Ma Yan, or Ishmael. Obviously, this is the Chinese rendering of the name. A large well was built there which never ran dry, even in a drought. If you go to sea and meet stormy waves, you can use this water to sprinkle over the sea to calm it. So there's, you can see the superstition that's there. So you can see that this report, and it's from 1225, the people believe that the well never ran dry, okay, even in a drought, and it's got magical powers. You can drop it overboard into the sea and it will miraculously calm it. Have you ever heard the Zamzam water being used for those purposes?
Well, like I said, I mean, it's been used for like either illnesses, people who have been burned, for instance. They think like it will cool it down and get some miraculous healings. You noticed that I agreed with one of our viewers that if people are demonically possessed, you spray them with the water of Zamzam. I mean, there's so many uses, and I'm sure people today will even make other claims. I remember they would put also pieces of the Quran paper in there, and you would drink it, and somehow it will do magics for you.
Yeah. So as you can see, these legends go way back. So this is from 1225, and no one seemed to be aware that the fact that it never ran dry wasn't miraculous, but it was the fact that there was an aqueduct in existence that was feeding it with water. And over the centuries, there were various natural disasters, earthquakes, and the aqueduct got damaged. And in those periods, the people in Mecca were in dire straits because they didn't have enough water. So that kind of disproves the idea that it never ran dry, really. So that's story number one. Story number two, it's a similar story about the Zamzam water. It was recorded 200 years later in the Ming dynasty. This time it was told by a Muslim actually traveling to Mecca. Okay, so it's from the year 1433. It's called Ying Yai Sheng Lan, the overall survey of the ocean's shores. And there it is in Chinese. And again, feel free to read it in Chinese if you're able to. So here it is in English. Behind the grave of Mahatma or Muhammad is a well, a spring of pure and sweet water named Abi Sansan. Men go to foreign parts, take this water and store it at the sides of their ships. If they meet a typhoon at sea, they take this water and scatter it, and the wind and waves are lulled. As you can see, that idea of using the water to calm the sea is still there. Scholars suggest that Abi Sansan could etymologically come from the Persian language meaning water of the Zamzam. Now, thankfully, I had an Iranian viewer who confirmed that that was the case. So
that makes sense because of the closer proximity between China and Persia, of course.
Yeah. And so the interesting thing there in that story is the fact it says behind the grave of Muhammad is a well. But I thought the Sin always said Muhammad was buried in Medina. And here they say he was buried in Mecca. So we can see that they haven't yet standardized the narrative around Muhammad. So we have two versions. Some versions say he was buried in Al-Masjid and Nabawi in Medina. And here we can see that as late as the 15th century, it is being claimed that Muhammad had been buried in Mecca. So they haven't yet managed to iron out the obvious discrepancies in the story about Muhammad. And so, it's very peculiar. And now the thing is, it's hard to account for that discrepancy because if the story of Muhammad is true, then surely they would know exactly where he was buried and there should be no confusion. But you have two stories, both claiming that Muhammad is buried in their city. Can't both be true. But it also could be that neither of them is true.
Amen.
So it was only in the 9th century that Mecca had a sufficient water supply to cope with pilgrims. Once it had the aqueduct in place, it could handle about 6,000 people visiting. Now I'm basing that on the idea that 1 cubic meter of water could supply comfortably 10 people. So that would give us about 6,000 people, maybe up to 8,000 people. Now I should actually point out I'm including in that figure people who are living there on a permanent basis plus pilgrims. So actually I may need to change that on future or in future presentations. But roughly we're talking about 6,000 people at any one time could be supported. It's unclear how Mecca managed to keep its water supply adequate in the years up to 1950. As you can imagine, the population was gradually growing. But I can imagine they would have needed to bring tankers in until they had an alternative source in place. The inadequate quantity of water in Mecca in the 8th century and the fact that it was as late as 791 AD before work began on an aqueduct would suggest that Mecca was not a place of any significance prior to that date. We can now see why Mecca was not included on any map until 900 AD. It hadn't the water to be a settlement until the aqueducts were built. And that's where I stop. So I'll come back to you.
Yes, wonderful. I was trying to check to see, someone was asking about the Zamzam in the Quran. I know it's not actually, to my knowledge, but I just didn't want to do an affirmative. The Quran does reference Safa, Marwa, does reference some benefits in there, and it could be in reference to the well itself. But again, folks, we need to be very careful not to always assume that whatever we're reading in the Quran or the Hadith is historical, meaning historically sound, because it seemed like this have been a process of embellishment, progressive process of additions and edits, and so on and so forth. And it could be reporting on something that is totally different than Mecca as we know it. The other day, I made a post on Facebook, and I said, if Mecca really is the intended location in one of the chapters of the Quran, when Allah swore by the fig tree and by the olive tree, then we have a problem, because there was no fig or olive. And to my knowledge, even if they have it today, they probably planted it now, but it didn't exist in there. So that leads you to believe that it's in reference to something close to a fig or olive. And of course, going north makes more sense, so it's quite possible that would be the case.
There's two things I'd like to bring in, and it's kind of a reminder, really. The fact that there is no historical record of Safa and Marwa prior to, I would say, prior to the establishment of Islam. These are not places that you will find in history books, say, centuries before. There's no confirmation of these places in Mecca. But where you do find a Safa and a Marwa mentioned in history going thousands of years back is in Jerusalem. So Mount Moriah, where the Temple Mount is called in Arabic Marwa. So there's Marwa. And Mount Scopus is Safa. Okay, so Safa is a Hebrew word, and it means to watch. So there are the places. So that, I think, that throws out Safa and Marwa in the Quran. It's not. You don't have to assume it's in the Hijaz, because we have two legitimate locations other than the Hijaz confirmed in historical records going back thousands of years before. So Josephus, writing around the time, the 1st century AD, mentions Safa. So it's really clear that it's Jerusalem. And the other thing is the Valley of Baca as well. So that, people say, well, Baca, Makkah, it's mentioned. And it's mentioned in the Psalms, and there's your proof. But if you actually look into where the Valley of Baca is, it's near to Damascus. It's between the Lebanon mountains and the anti-Lebanon mountains. There's a valley there. It's not that far from Damascus, so it's way up there in the north. And when it was being referred to in the Psalms, it was meant as a symbol for the Jewish pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So it has a totally different biblical meaning. So we've talked about the Valley of Baca, the Valley of Tears. It's referencing the tears of the pilgrims making their way on pilgrimage to the Hag. In Hebrew, the word is Hag, Hagg. Now, in Arabic, it's Hajj, but actually, if you go to places like Yemen and go to Egypt, they still pronounce that as Hag.
Exactly.
And you can see that that's where the word comes from. Odin Lafontaine actually talks about the fact that in the Arabic etymology, if you go back far enough, it makes no sense to use that word for pilgrimage. It's been inherited, he would say.
Wonderful. One last question, brother, before we wrap it up here. And I want to apologize to everybody because I have to run into another meeting immediately after this. And I hope you're enjoying, of course, this research. You see why I love to bring Brother Mel. Tomorrow, I will be with Jay, by the way. It will be a late nighter. We will be talking about the Aramaic and the Quran. So we're hitting the standard Islamic narrative from a variety of angles. I'll bring Odom pretty soon here. He and I are working on stuff, but me and Mel will continue to do this kind of work. One quick question. I know Dan Gibson talks about Zamzam in Petra. Have you investigated that?
Yeah, he has an excellent explanation for Petra, which is to do the I can't pronounce it, the Zubaida giants living in the mountains above Petra.
Got it.
It's a good idea. The alternative explanation that I've had suggested to me by a person who spoke Hebrew, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but he mentioned that there's a word in Hebrew which means the sound of water gurgling, and it's zoom. So a simpler explanation might be simply just it's a descriptive word in reference to a spring, and so therefore you could use that word almost anywhere where there's a spring. So I haven't been able to independently confirm that, but yeah. So one Hebrew speaker said that's the alternative explanation. So take your pick.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Now, I just brought it up because I want to show people that you're on top of these things. You're aware of these other theses, and that doesn't mean we're here trying to shoot down any other ideas. All it means is that there is more and more evidence to point to something that is not Mecca. I mean, that's the bottom line here, and that's what I want to emphasize.
Yeah. So.
Very good. What's coming up work-wise on your channel, and on also what other topics you think we should explore here, so we can give people some heads up?
Okay, so at the minute, what I'm doing a series called Quran Traditions. So you can probably work out what that's about. So
I have to say, 2 years ago, I did do a couple of posts on Facebook, call them Quran Traditions, but I'll have my attorney contact you over
okay,
that.
I wasn't aware of that. So.
No, I'm just kidding.
I'll write a check to you. Yeah, it's kind of yeah. I thought it was original there with that one, but obviously not. But yeah, so there is a video on that coming out later today, and I hope to do maybe one a week. But I think if I were to do one a week, I think I will never run out of material because there are literally hundreds and hundreds. So that's what I'm looking at the minute. And in terms of research, I'm looking at the story of Andalusia. So I'm reading a book about that. So, it's a different period to what I normally look at, slightly a bit later. But that's a bit of an eye opener.
Yeah, Dr. Bill Warner, about maybe 7 years ago or 8 years ago, I was in a presentation where he was telling people that the history of Andalusia is not as pretty as everybody thinks.
Absolutely.
And he was among the first to bring the spotlight on it. I know that Thomas is addressing something like that on Jay's channel as well. So it'll be good for the two of us to also address that.
Yeah. So it's all relatively new. I'm trying to kind of figure out the facts from fiction, but it's clearly, again, there was a standard Islamic narrative placed over this one, yeah, there's a lot to be revealed, I think, in that area as well. So it's a great time to be alive, is all I'm going to say, because it's amazing to see so many researchers sharing their ideas and moving forward. And I think we're moving forward at a rate much faster than it could have been done 100 years ago because of the internet. The internet has opened up everything.
Absolutely. And I thank the Lord for people like yourself, like Dr. J, like Odin, like the others. And I thank the Lord also for platforms like this that he has blessed us with, because of the courageous work that you guys are doing. And I just play a small, tiny part in just at least being there to endorse what you guys are doing. I think others are becoming more and more encouraged now to at least come forward with their own findings. Even if they do it in a subtle way, we're thankful that at least more and more people are coming forward with that. But the beauty is this: the research has been done by others, like Patricia Crone, for instance, or Michael Cook, or others. And our job is to really take a deep dive, no pun intended, and grab some of these findings and bring it up to the surface. You cannot blame some of them for the amount of risk they can take and the flack that they will be facing. If they try to come forward, they can lose their livelihood altogether. So we understand, we don't want to minimize the importance of what they're doing.
Yeah. So thank you so much for bringing me on, and it was a pleasure to talk to you as always.
As always, thank you so much. We've been blessed. Everybody go and check Cira International, because we have a series that we've been doing about holes in the narrative of Islam. And brother, I think I told you this, but you have the right also and the freedom to take these videos as we publish them, to also publish them on your channel, so that we can broaden the platform as well.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. Hope you've enjoyed it. Always reach out to me or to Mel. Consider supporting Mel. Consider supporting my channel. Consider subscribing to our channels. And until next time, everyone, have a blessed day. This is Fadi, over and out. God bless.